So when we talk about risk assessment, so how do we define risk? So risk is the probability that a given threat source will exploit a particular weakness and that a resulting impact would occur. So risk is managed so that it does not materially impact the business process in an adverse way. Also, when we talk about risk, it is inherent in all activities. When we talk about the organizations need to determine the level of risk the organization is willing to take to achieve its financial and organizational goals. So, risk assessment is the first step. It is the first process in the risk management methodology. Organizations use risk assessment to determine the extent of the potential threat and the risks associated with an IT system throughout its SDLC. The output of this process, it helps to identify like the appropriate controls that are needed for reducing or like eliminating the risks during the risk mitigation process. Are there any questions at this point? So let's look at risk assessment terminology. So first, let's look at threat. What is a threat? So a threat could be a potential source of a negative event that may result in harm to our organization, our systems, or our assets. Or it could be any potential danger to the information lifecycle. Let's look at vulnerability. Vulnerability is also like it is a flaw or a weakness in the system that could result in a security breach or a violation of the system's security policy. Likelihood, it means the possibility of a potential risk occurring. We are going to look at the examples of these terms later in the slides. So, impact refers to the magnitude of harm that could be caused by a threat's exercise of a vulnerability. So, let's look at some examples. So, these are loss scenarios. So, you can see in the first scenario, the hacker steals the data, publicly blackmails the company. So, what kind of data he had stolen? The customer data. What is the size of the loss? He has stolen 1,000 records to 10,000 records. So, the loss is then determined in different ways like reputation loss, lawsuit loss, fines or regulation loss, or market loss, and expected loss per year. So here what we can see is we defined in the previous slide threat, vulnerability, likelihood, and impact. So here what is the threat? Hacker is the threat. So he is looking for data that he can use to blackmail the company. What is the vulnerability in this case? So vulnerability is like the data is not properly protected. So the data, when it is not properly protected, it can be stolen by the hacker. And the hacker can use the data to publicly blackmail the company. And then the impact is like defined in terms of loss in this in this table. So when we talk about loss of information, the loss of information may affect processes outside the scope of its owner's control. So, structured walkthroughs with business process owners based on specific scenarios of information loss or impairment can help pinpoint where and how particular assets might affect operations. So, the valuations may need to be accurate provided the assessment process is consistent and produces results within appropriate ranges. So here we can also see in the second example, the employee steals data, sells data to competitors. So in this case as well, we can see that the threat is the employee, that is an insider threat, and he steals strategic plan. What is the type of the data? That is the strategic plan. And the size of loss, the strategic plan was of a 3 year, so the reputational loss, the lawsuit loss, the fines, they are minimal, but the market loss is US dollars 20 million. And the expected loss per year is 2 million US dollars. So In this case, the threat is the insider, the employee, and the vulnerability is again the data is not properly protected, it is not encrypted, and it is easily accessible to the employee as the access has been granted, and he is motivated to sell the data to its competitors. Moving on, let's look at different threat sources. So, a threat source is defined as any circumstance or event with the potential to cause harm to an IT system. So, the common threat sources can be natural, human, or environmental. In assessing threat sources, like when we assess the threat sources, it is important to consider all potential threat sources that could cause harm to an IT system and its processing environment. So, humans can also be threat sources, as we saw in the previous slide. They could be a hacker, they could be an insider, a malicious outsider, or an insider. So they could like deliberately attack the company they are working for, or if it is a malicious outsider, they can try to hack into the systems if proper security controls are not there to protect their systems. So let's look at natural threat sources are also there. Like we when we talk about floods, or if a fire occurs and you can no longer serve the customers of your company, and similarly earthquakes can also occur. Other threat sources are also defined here. Moving on, when we talk about risk assessment, we talk about risk assessment activities. So there are 9 steps in risk assessment. Let's talk through them one by one, and then we are going to discuss them in detail. So step one is system characterization. So in step one, we characterize the system. We talk about the system hardware, softwares, modules, and we characterize them. In step two, we identify the threats. In step three, we identify vulnerabilities or the weaknesses in the system. Then we analyze the controls that are already applied. Then we look at likelihood, then impact, and once the likelihood and impact analysis has been done, then we can determine the risk. After that, when we have determined the risk, we can provide control recommendation that you can apply this control to remediate this risk. And in the end, we make a report of all the processes that we have carried out. So we will look at these steps one by one now. So starting with system characterization. So when we are talking about system characterization, we are assessing risks for an IT system. So the first step is to define the scope of system characterization. So in this step, the boundaries of the IT systems are defined along with the resources and the information that constitute the system. For example, we can define the hardware, software, system interfaces, the data that is being used by the organization, the system mission, and the data that is critical to the organization, and the data sensitivity. So this is system related information. Now coming on to the information gathering techniques. There are 3 types of information gathering techniques that we can use to process the system characterization step. So when we talk about information gathering techniques, one of them is questionnaire. So for the questionnaire, we want to collect the relevant information. So the risk assessment team can develop a questionnaire that could concerning the management and the operational controls that are being planned or they are being used for the IT system in the organization. So this questionnaire could be distributed to the applicable technical and non-technical management staff who are designing and supporting the IT systems. And the questionnaire could also be used like during the visits, like when you're visiting the organization and you're conducting interviews. So the second information gathering technique is interviews. So you have to conduct interviews with the IT systems support staff and like the management teams to enable the risk assessment team to like collect useful information about the IT system. For example, how their system is operating, how their mission critical processes are being performed. So, on-site visits also allow risk assessment personnel to observe and gather information about the physical, environmental, and operational security of the IT systems. So, in the end, another information gathering technique is document review. So, in document review, we look at the policy documents. We could also look at system documentation that is being defined by the company. Let's say they have defined a user guide, they have made some sort of manuals, or they have like defined some sort of security related documentation, such as like they have some audit reports or risk assessment reports and security policies. They can provide good information about security controls that are being used by the organization, and they are planned for the IT system. So, an organization's mission impact analysis or asset criticality assessment provides information regarding system and data criticality and sensitivity. So, this is the first step where we characterize the system of the company. Moving on, the step two is threat identification. As we talked in the previous examples, how do we identify the threat? So, a threat is the potential for a particular threat source to successfully exercise a particular vulnerability. And the vulnerability, what is a vulnerability? It is a weakness that can be accidentally triggered or intentionally exploited. So, a threat source does not present a risk when there is no vulnerability that can be exercised. So, when there is no weakness, a threat source cannot exploit the weakness if there is no weakness. So, the goal of this step is to identify the potential threat sources and compile a threat statement listing potential threat sources that are applicable to the IT system that is being evaluated. So, we want to like identify the threat sources. So, for example, you can see in this diagram, we can look at different threat sources, that is hacker, and what is his motivation. He wants to challenge the organization. It could be ego, it could be rebellion. And what can he do? He can do hacking, he can perform social engineering. He could like send an email, and then the user clicks on the link, and the hacker gets access to the internal systems of the organization. System intrusion, break-ins, unauthorized system access. Similarly, another threat source could be a computer criminal. He wants to, what is his motivation? He wants to destruct the information. He wants illegal information disclosure, or he could want like some sort of financial gain or monetary gain. And he could also like, his motivation could be like unauthorized data alteration. So what can he do? He can perform computer crime, fraudulent acts, information bribery, spoofing, and system intrusion. So this is the second step, that is the threat identification. Moving on to the third step, that is vulnerability identification. Once you have identified the threat, now we are going to look at the vulnerability, so the weakness in the system. So, the analysis of the threat to an IT system must include an analysis of the vulnerabilities associated with the system environment. The goal of this step is to develop a list of system vulnerabilities, flaws, or weaknesses that could be exploited by the potential threat sources that we discussed in the previous slide. So, when we talk about vulnerability identification, it could be done in multiple ways. Some of the ways are mentioned here, that is the vulnerability sources, system security testing, and the development of security requirements checklist. So, when we talk about vulnerability sources, documented vulnerability sources that should be considered in a thorough vulnerability analysis are considered. So, we can look at previous risk assessment documentation of the IT system. We can also look at audit reports. We could also look at system anomaly reports, security review reports, and system test and evaluation reports. We could also look at some of the commonly like well-known databases of vulnerabilities, such as NIST. We could also look at commercial CERT teams documents to like find the vulnerabilities, to identify the vulnerabilities. So the second point is the system security testing. So this is a proactive method that employs testing that could be used to identify system vulnerabilities efficiently and depending on the criticality of the IT system and the available resources. So the system security testing could be carried out like using an automated vulnerability scanning tool. It could be done using security testing and evaluation, and it could also be done using penetration testing. Last but not the least, we are going to develop a security requirements checklist. A requirements checklist contains the basic security standards that can be used to systematically evaluate and identify the vulnerabilities of the assets, like this hardware, software information, procedures, processes, and information transfers associated with a given IT system. Moving on to the step 4, that is the control analysis. Is there any question at this point?
Okay, Mr. For
So,
the previous slide, can you just go previous slide?
previous slide, this
Yeah,
slide?
yeah,
Sure.
yes. The last point, development of security requirement checklist. So this is will be like as a result of risk register, right? Will not be
It
included
could
in the
be,
risk
or
register.
it could be like a result of the risk register, or it could be developed independently as well. You can develop a security requirements checklist, and you can like mention the security controls that you have applied against those checklists, and then you can like see the vulnerabilities that are there in your system against which no
Yeah.
controls are being applied.
Okay. So it will be as a guidance to me to fill the risk register.
Yeah, it could be. It could be.
Okay. Okay, great. Yes, thank you.
Anyone else? So let's look at the step 4, that is the control analysis. So the goal of this step is to analyze the controls that have been implemented or are planned for implementation by the organization to minimize or eliminate the likelihood of a threat exercising a system vulnerability. So we are going to talk about the control analysis in 3 points, that is the control methods, the control categories, and the control analysis technique. So when we talk about control methods, the security controls, they encompass like they are of two types. They are technical and non-technical security controls. So when we talk about technical controls, we are talking about the safeguards that are incorporated into the computer hardware, software, or firmware. For example, let's take an example of control methods, technical control methods. That is like an IAM solution, that is identification and access management solution, or it could be an access control mechanism, or it could be an encryption method. So these are technical controls. When we talk about non-technical controls, they are management and operational controls such as security policies, operational procedures, and physical and environmental security methods. Moving on to the control categories. So here we are going to look at two type of control categories. So control categories could be like the controls could be divided into two based on the measures they are going to provide. So let's say there is a measure that is like encryption. Encryption is going to like prevent disclosure. So encryption is a preventive control. So preventive control inhibits attempts to violate security policy. On the other hand, there are detective controls. So detective controls, they are warn of violations and attempted violations of security policies. And they could like include controls such as like an IDS, that is an intrusion detection system. So the purpose of an intrusion detection system is to like detect an intrusion and notify the system administrator that an intrusion has occurred. So it is a detective control. So now let's talk about control analysis techniques. So in the step 3 of the secure risk assessment process, we studied the security requirements checklist. So it could be used like to check the controls that are being applied, and it could be used to validate the security compliance as well as non-compliance. So it is essential to update such checklists to reflect changes in an organization's control environment. So if the controls are changing, like the control is the currently applied controls are changed, so the checklist has to be updated. So to ensure the checklist's validity. Moving on to the likelihood determination. So likelihood, we want to know that how likely it is for a threat actor to actually exploit a weakness in the system. So to derive an overall likelihood rating that indicates the probability that a potential vulnerability may be exercised within the construct of the associated threat environment, we need to consider three factors. So the three factors are the threat source motivation and capability, the nature of the vulnerability, and the existence and effectiveness of the current controls. So let's look at this diagram. Three likelihood levels are defined. So here we can see in the likelihood level high, we can see that the threat source is highly motivated and he is sufficiently capable to like exploit the vulnerability. And the controls to prevent the vulnerability from being exercised are ineffective. So the controls that are being applied are ineffective, they are not effective at all. And the threat source itself is highly motivated and he is capable, right? So in this case, the likelihood level would be high. So it is very likely that the threat source would be able to exploit the vulnerability. Now let's look at the medium level. So when we talk about the medium level, the threat source is motivated and capable, but controls are in place that may impede successful exercise of the vulnerability. So the controls are in place that are going to stop the threat source from exploiting that vulnerability. So the likelihood is medium. So it is not as likely as in the first case. So now moving on to the likelihood level low. So the threat source itself, it lacks motivation or capability. It doesn't have the ability to like exploit the vulnerability or the weakness in the system. And we have controls that are in place to prevent or at least significantly impede the vulnerability from being exercised. So in this case, the threat source or the person who wants to exploit the vulnerability, he does not have the motivation or the ability to exploit the weakness in the system. And also what is there, the security controls are also in place. So the security controls are so strong that they are going to prevent the threat source from exploiting that weakness. So in this case, the likelihood level would be low. Now moving on to the impact analysis. So the impact analysis is the major step in like the risk assessment and in measuring the level of risk. So we are going to determine the adverse impact that could result from a successful threat exercise of a vulnerability. So if the threat source is successful in like exploiting the weakness in the system, what is going to be the impact, how the impact is being quantified. So in this table, you can see the impact is also like defined in three magnitudes: high, medium, or low. And we are going to talk about, like, first we are going to talk about the high impact. So in this case, the vulnerability is exploited. So it may result in the highly costly loss of major tangible assets or resources of the organization. So in this case, the organization may lose it's like highly costly, like very expensive assets or resources. It may also like the if the threat actor is able to like exploit the vulnerability, it may significantly harm or impede an organization's mission, reputation, or interest. So it may also harm the interest or the reputation of the organization as well. And it could also result in human death or serious injury. So the impact is very high in this case. So So when we talk about medium impact, we are talking about like the threat actor is being able to exploit the weakness. So the result would be the in like costly loss of tangible assets or resources. So these assets are not that expensive as compared to the previous level. As you can see, it is written that it is highly costly loss. So yeah, so when we talk about costly loss, so it is not as costly as in the high impact scenario. So when we talk about the organization's reputation, it could also like harm the organization's reputation or mission. It could also result in human injury as well. So the magnitude of the impact is defined as medium for this case. For low, in this case, the organization may lose like some of its assets or resources. They are not expensive, and it may like affect the organization's reputation. But there is no human injury or the human death, so the impact is low. All of this, it goes around like it comes around like the initial concepts that we talked about: the loss of confidentiality, the loss of integrity, and the loss of availability. Moving on, now once we have done like the likelihood determination and the impact analysis, now we are going to look at the risk determination. So the purpose of this step is to assess the level of risk to the IT system. The determination of risk for a particular threat or the vulnerability pair could be like expressed in the function of like the likelihood that we discussed in the previous slides, like the likelihood of a given threat source attempting to exercise or exploit a given weakness, and the magnitude of the impact should a threat source successfully exploit the vulnerability, and what are the controls that are there for reducing or eliminating the risk. So to measure the risk, a risk scale and a risk level metrics must be developed. The risk scale with its ratings, it could be high, medium, low, or it could be very high, high, medium, low, very low. It could range from organization to organization. It depends on the organization. So it represents the degree or the level of risk to which an IT system, facility, or procedure that might be exposed if a given vulnerability is exploited. So the risk scale also like presents actions that senior management, the mission owners must take for each risk level. The final determination of the mission risk is derived by multiplying the ratings assigned for likelihood, that is the probability, and the impact. So in this diagram, on the right side, you can see the risk levels are being defined. So when you see like the high risk, if an observation or finding is evaluated as a high risk, so there is a strong need for corrective measures. So we need controls to be there to like reduce the risk or like completely eradicate it. So an existing system may continue to operate, but a corrective action plan must be put in place as soon as possible. So this is like high, this is critical. So it needs to be implemented as soon as possible. So when we talk about like the medium risk level, so in the medium risk level, if an observation is rated as medium risk, so corrective actions are needed and a plan must be developed to incorporate these actions within a reasonable period of time. So the time period of the medium risk level is more than the high risk level. Moving on to the low risk level, if an observation is described as low risk, the system's designated authority must determine whether corrective actions are still required or decide to accept the risks. So, in the low risk level, the designated authority or the system administrator, he must determine like if the controls are needed at this point, or they can just accept the risk in that case. Now let's look at the table in the left corner. So Here we see the threat likelihood and the impact on the X and Y columns of the matrix. So when we look at the likelihood, we see we have discussed this earlier that it is like defined in high, medium, and low. And similarly, impact is also defined high, medium, and low. And when we define the likelihood, we have assigned quantitative values to the high, medium, and low values. And similarly, for the impact levels, high, medium, and low, we have also assigned quantitative values. Like for the high impact, we have assigned 100. We have for medium impact, we have assigned 50. And then for low impact, we have to assign 10. When we look at the table itself, like below the x and y axis of the impact and the likelihood, we see the intersection between the threat and the likelihood, and that is the result of the multiplication of the values that are assigned to the likelihood and the impact. So you can see, and at the left, at the right bottom, so the low impact and low likelihood is in the right bottom, low, uh, it is high impact and low likelihood. So when we take low likelihood 0.1 and high impact 100, the value comes out to be 10. So it is low risk because the likelihood is very low. Even if the impact is very high, but the likelihood of a threat actor exploiting that weakness is very low. So this is how we read the risk level matrix. We see the intersection and we multiply the values that are being written in the x and y axis, and we define the threat, we define the risk based on that. Are there any questions? No? So let's look at step 8 then. So once we have like determined the risk, we saw in the previous slide, we have determined the value of the risk, and we have defined that high risk, low risk, and medium risk. And now we are going to look at control recommendations. So during this step of the process, controls that could mitigate or eliminate the identified risks as appropriate to the organization's operations are provided. So here, all possible recommended controls, they could be implemented to reduce the loss and to determine which ones are required and appropriate for a specific organization. We conduct a cost benefit analysis for the proposed recommended controls. So the goal of the recommended controls is to reduce the level of the risk to the IT system and its data to an acceptable level. The control recommendations are the results of the risk assessment process and provide input to the risk mitigation process, during which the recommended procedural and technical security controls are evaluated, prioritized, and implemented. Moving on to the last step of the risk assessment process, that is the results documentation. So once the risk assessment has been completed, threat sources, vulnerabilities are identified. The results should be documented in an official report that is also known as the risk assessment report. And a risk assessment report is a management report that helps the senior management, the mission owners, make decisions based on policy, procedure, budget, and system operation and management changes. So, unlike an audit or investigative report, which looks at the wrongdoings, a risk assessment report should not be presented in an accusatory manner, but as a systematic analytical approach to assessing risks so that the senior management can understand the risks and they can allocate the resources to reduce and correct potential losses.